Hey there, tonight we start our descent into the darker corners of East Asian history. We're exploring what it meant to be enslaved in ancient Japan and Korea, where your personhood was just another commodity to be traded away. And let's be honest, if you found yourself in these systems, your chances of regaining freedom were about as likely as finding a smartphone in a samurai's pocket. So now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. Before there were elaborate systems of bondage, before legal codes formalized human ownership, there existed more primitive forms of unfreedom in both the Korean peninsula and Japanese archipelago. These shadowy origins of slavery reach back into prehistory, where archaeological evidence suggests social stratification appeared quite early. You might imagine these prehistoric societies as egalitarian utopias. They were not. The bones tell different stories. What we're looking at in these earliest periods, roughly from 1000 BCE onward, are societies transitioning from hunter-gatherer existence to more settled agricultural communities. This transition itself creates the conditions for one human to control another. When you attach yourself permanently to land, you can be attached permanently to someone else. Surplus production makes it economically viable to keep captives alive rather than simply killing them. In the Korean peninsula, particularly in what archaeologists call the Mumun pottery period, we see the first evidence of significant social stratification. Burial sites from this era contain dramatic differences in grave goods, some individuals surrounded by precious items, others with nearly nothing. While this doesn't definitively prove slavery existed, it establishes the hierarchical social structures necessary for institutional unfreedom to emerge. Across the water in the Japanese archipelago, the Ye period, roughly 900 BCE to 300 CE, similarly shows the first major signs of social inequality. Rice paddy agriculture, labor-intensive and requiring coordination, creates perfect conditions for coerced labor systems. Those magnificent terraced paddies you see in travel brochures, someone had to build them, bucket by backbreaking bucket. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't yet the fully developed slavery that would emerge later. These early forms were likely more fluid, perhaps closer to what anthropologists might call debt bondage or client relationships. You might belong to a household not as property exactly, but as a dependent with severely limited rights. Your children might inherit your status, or they might not. The boundaries were hazier. What's fascinating is that both Korean and Japanese mythologies contain hints of these early unfree relationships. The founding myths of Japan, recorded much later in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, reference various subordinate peoples who served the divine imperial line. These earth spiders, or tsuchigumo, were often portrayed as non-human or semi-human, but scholars today recognize them as likely representing conquered indigenous peoples. When mythology dehumanizes a group, it often justifies their subjugation. Korean foundation myths similarly contain references to subordinate groups. The Samguk Sagi, compiled in the 12th century, but drawing on much older traditions, contains references to low people who served the founders of the early kingdoms. This distinction between highborn and lowborn would eventually crystallize into more formal slave systems. By around the 3rd century CE in Korea, Chinese records begin to mention a class called nobai, or bangno, terms that would later explicitly mean slave. These early Chinese accounts describe Korean society as highly stratified, with clear distinctions between nobles, commoners, and unfree people. The Chinese, themselves possessing elaborate systems of unfreedom, recognized familiar patterns in Korean society. Japan's earliest written records come later, but by the time of the Taika reform in 645 CE, we see clear references to unfree people called nuhai. The reforms themselves attempted to reshape Japanese society along Chinese bureaucratic lines, including formalizing the status of various types of slaves. What makes early slavery in both regions particularly interesting is how it often blended with notions of kinship. You weren't just a slave, you were incorporated into a household, albeit in the lowliest position. This integration was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, you might receive some minimal protections as a quasi-family member. On the other hand, this arrangement blurred the lines between slavery and family obligation, making resistance more complicated. Environmental factors played their part too. The mountainous terrain of both the Korean peninsula and Japanese archipelago created isolated valleys where local power structures could develop with minimal outside interference. A powerful clan leader in a remote valley could essentially rule as law, determining who was free and who was bound, with little check on their authority. The archaeological record reveals another uncomfortable truth about early slavery in these regions: human sacrifice. Burial sites from both cultures sometimes contain remains positioned in ways suggesting sacrificial killings. These unfortunate souls, often determined to be outsiders through isotope analysis of their remains, likely represent the most extreme form of unfreedom, those whose very lives could be extinguished at the whim of the powerful. There's an eerily beautiful tomb complex at Ishibutai in Japan's Nara prefecture, a massive stone burial chamber you can still visit today. The enormous stones, some weighing over 60 tons, didn't move themselves. Whoever was buried there commanded enough human labor to create what was, for its time, the equivalent of a small pyramid. Those laborers weren't enthusiastic volunteers showing up for community service day. Trade between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago dates back to prehistoric times, and archaeological evidence suggests human beings were among the commodities exchanged. Skeletal remains in Japan sometimes show Korean morphological characteristics, while cultural artifacts cross back and forth. Some of the first potters in Japan may have been Korean captives, bringing their superior ceramic techniques with them in bondage. By the 4th century CE, both regions were developing more complex state structures, although Korea, with its closer proximity to China, generally moved faster in this direction. The Three Kingdoms period in Korea, Goguryeo, Beach, and Silla, saw increasingly sophisticated legal and social systems, including more formalized categories of unfreedom. Japanese state formation would follow similar patterns, but at a somewhat later date. What's particularly striking is that in both cultures, the development of Buddhism, ostensibly a compassionate religion, did little to challenge the institution of slavery. In fact, Buddhist temples in both Korea and Japan became major slaveholders, owning large numbers of people who worked temple lands. The karmic framework of Buddhism sometimes even provided convenient justification. Perhaps these slaves were working off bad karma from previous lives. Spiritual liberation might be central to Buddhism, but physical liberation was another matter entirely. As we transition from these shadowy origins into more documented periods, remember that slavery wasn't an aberration in these societies. It was foundational. The magnificent cultural achievements of ancient Korea and Japan rest on the bent backs of countless unnamed, unfree individuals. Their labor built the temples, tended the rice fields, wove the silks, and fired the ceramics we now display in museums. And here's a quirky detail that archaeologists have uncovered. Some slaves in ancient Korea wore distinctive earrings, small clay hoops that may have marked their status. Imagine wearing your bondage literally attached to your body, a constant physical reminder of your place in the world. The formalization of slavery in both ancient Korea and Japan didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of legal codification, borrowing heavily from Chinese models while adapting to local conditions. By the 6th and 7th centuries CE, what had once been fluid arrangements of dependency hardened into rigid legal categories that would persist for centuries. In Korea, the Three Kingdoms period saw the first comprehensive legal codes, Goguryeo, Beach, and Silla, each competing for dominance, developed increasingly bureaucratic states that needed clear definitions of status. The Silla Kingdom's bone rank system, Galpam, provides a fascinating window into just how stratified society had become. At the top sat the sacred bone Seongal and true bone Jingal aristocracy, while at the very bottom were the slaves, called Nobai or Seonbai, depending on the context and time period. The unified Silla period saw further refinements to these codes. What's particularly noteworthy is how meticulous record-keeping became. Household registers listed each person by status, including slaves, who were recorded as possessions alongside land and livestock. A fragment of one such register survives from this period, listing 2 adult male slaves, 1 female slave, 1 slave child as assets of a provincial official. Notice how the document doesn't bother with their names, just their utility as property. Japan's adoption of formal slavery institutions followed a similar path, but with its own peculiarities. The Teiho Code of 701 CE and the Yarrow Code of 718 CE, heavily influenced by Tang Dynasty China, explicitly defined various categories of unfree people. The term Nuhai became the standard designation for slaves, but the system was more complex than this single term suggests. There were public slaves, Kanko or Kanu, who belonged to the state, and private slaves, Shinuhi, who belonged to individuals or temples. Further distinctions existed between hereditary slaves, lasting generations, and those serving limited terms for specific reasons, like debt or criminal punishment. The legal minutiae might seem academic to us now, but these distinctions meant everything to those living within these systems, determining whether your children would inherit your bondage or whether you might someday walk free. What's particularly striking about both Korean and Japanese systems is how they incorporated slavery into otherwise sophisticated legal frameworks. These weren't lawless societies, they were highly structured ones, where unfreedom was woven into the very fabric of the law. The same legal codes that established taxation, criminal punishment, and property rights also carefully delineated who could be owned and under what circumstances. The influence of Chinese legal traditions cannot be overstated. Both Korea and Japan adopted elements of the Tang legal code, including its provisions for slavery, but they modified these elements to suit local conditions and traditions. For instance, Japan developed a more complex gradation of unfree statuses than existed in China, while Korea's system became in some ways more rigid and hereditary than its Chinese counterpart. One quirky detail that survived in Japanese legal documents: slaves could be designated as either speaking tools, those with specialized skills, or moving tools, those used primarily for manual labor. Yes, human beings were legally categorized alongside hammers and plows, distinguished only by their ability to talk while they worked. Prices for slaves were carefully regulated in both societies. Records from unified Silla Korea suggest that an adult male slave might cost the equivalent of 40 bolts of silk, roughly the same as 5 good horses. In Japan, the Injishiki, a collection of regulations from the early Heian period, lists official valuations for different categories of slaves, with female slaves of childbearing age typically fetching the highest prices. After all, they represented not just their own labor, but the potential for future generations of unfree laborers. The gendered dimension of slavery deserves particular attention. In both societies, female slaves faced unique vulnerabilities. Their reproductive capacity was considered a valuable asset. Their children automatically became the property of their owner. Japanese documents from the 8th century even contain provisions for compensating owners if a female slave miscarried due to overwork or abuse, treating the unborn child as damaged property rather than a lost human life. Both systems developed intricate rules around the status of children born to relationships between people of different ranks. In Korea, the principle typically followed was that children inherited the status of their mother, a convenient rule for male slaveholders who fathered children with enslaved women. Japan had similar provisions, though with more exceptions and complexity. These rules reveal how systems of bondage were fundamentally concerned with reproduction and self-perpetuation across generations. What might surprise modern observers is how thoroughly these slave systems were integrated with religious institutions. Buddhist temples in both Korea and Japan became major slaveholders, sometimes owning hundreds or even thousands of individuals. Temple slaves, Giano in Korea, Terako or Nubido in Japan, maintained the physical structures, worked temple lands, and provided the economic foundation that supported monastic life. Surviving temple records meticulously account for these human assets, sometimes listing them alongside livestock inventories. These religious institutions developed elaborate justifications for slave ownership. Some argued that putting slaves to work in sacred spaces was actually benefiting them karmically, positioning slavery as a form of spiritual uplift for the enslaved. Others simply treated slave ownership as an unremarkable economic necessity. The contradiction between Buddhist precepts of compassion and the brutal realities of bondage seems to have troubled few religious authorities. By the time the Goryeo dynasty emerged in Korea and the Heian period was flourishing in Japan, slavery had become fully institutionalized, with clear registration systems and inheritance patterns. The Goryeo dynasty, in particular, saw an expansion of the slave population. Scholars estimate that by the late Goryeo period, slaves may have constituted nearly half of the Korean population. The economic foundation of the state literally rested on unfree labor. Japan's slavery system during the Heian period took on its own peculiarities. The imperial court and aristocracy in Kyoto maintained slave households, but there was also the emergence of various dependent statuses that weren't quite slavery, but weren't freedom either. The increasing power of provincial warrior elites led to new forms of bondage as well, with local strongmen commanding the labor of dependent peasants in arrangements that blurred the line between serfdom and slavery. Both systems developed mechanisms for the transfer of slaves. Sales contracts from Goryeo Korea survive, containing chillingly matter-of-fact language. This female slave, aged 23, with no physical defects, is hereby transferred with all future offspring. Some Japanese documents contain similar provisions, though slave sales in Japan more often went through government offices that collected taxes on the transactions, providing yet another layer of institutional support for human bondage. What's particularly notable is how both societies developed ways to publicly mark slave status. In Korea, slaves often wore distinctive clothing or hairstyles. Legal codes specified that they could not wear the same types of hats or clothing as free people. In Japan, some enslaved individuals were tattooed or branded, particularly those who had been reduced to slavery as criminal punishment. These visible markers served as constant public reminders of status, ensuring that slaves could not easily pass as free. The institutional frameworks also specified punishments for slaves who violated various rules. These punishments were typically more severe than those applied to free people for equivalent offenses. A Silla Law Code fragment indicates that a free person who committed theft might face corporal punishment, while a slave committing the same offense could be executed. Japanese legal texts similarly prescribed harsher penalties for unfree people, reflecting the universal principle that those at the bottom of society faced the most brutal enforcement of social boundaries. Perhaps most revealing are the provisions for what happened when slaves attempted to escape. Both societies treated this as among the most serious offenses possible. Korean law prescribed severe flogging, facial tattooing, and additional years of service for first offenses, with death commonly resulting for repeat attempts. Japanese codes contained similar provisions, often adding provisions that punished anyone who harbored or helped escaped slaves. The two systems did have their differences. Korean slavery tended to be more hereditary and fixed, while Japanese unfreedom sometimes included pathways to manumission or status improvement. Korean slaves were more likely to work in large groups on aristocratic or royal estates, while Japanese slaves more commonly worked in smaller household units, though there were many exceptions in both directions. By the time both societies entered what historians consider their medieval periods, Japan's Kamakura period, beginning in 1185, and Korea's Joseon dynasty, established in 1392, the institutional frameworks of slavery were thoroughly entrenched, even as they continued to evolve in response to changing economic and political conditions. These frameworks would prove remarkably durable, persisting in various forms for centuries to come. For the slave in both ancient Korea and Japan, the day begins before the sun fully crests the horizon. Perhaps you're sleeping on a thin straw mat in a corner of your owner's house, if you're a domestic slave, or in a crude hut near the fields, if you're an agricultural worker. Either way, your accommodations are minimal, just enough to keep you functional as a human tool. Your first task of the day might be to start the fire for the household, carefully coaxing flames from embers preserved overnight. The smoke stings your eyes as you feed the fire with dried grass and twigs, but you've long since grown accustomed to this daily irritation. In Korean households, you'd be stoking the ondol, the underfloor heating system that kept the Yongbin nobility warm, while you shivered in unheated servants' quarters. Agricultural slaves in both societies faced particularly brutal daily routines centered around rice cultivation. Rice is demanding. It requires flooding, draining, weeding, and precise timing at every stage. During planting season, you might spend 14 hours bent double in knee-deep water, meticulously placing rice seedlings in neat rows. Your back would ache permanently, your hands would crack and bleed, and leeches would be a constant companion. The tools you used were simple wooden plows, stone or iron hoes, woven baskets. Their primitive nature made the work even more physically demanding. And don't imagine you could take frequent breaks. Overseers, often slaves themselves, but elevated to supervisory positions, would ensure a relentless pace. In Korean estates, these overseers, called changji, carried whips and were authorized to use them freely. One quirky archaeological discovery from a Japanese site revealed slave quarters with distinctive post holes indicating shackles or restraints attached to sleeping areas, suggesting that some agricultural slaves were literally chained at night to prevent escape. Sleep itself became another form of bondage. Domestic slaves experienced a different kind of labor, less physically punishing, but in many ways more psychologically invasive. You would be constantly present in the intimate spaces of your owners, yet simultaneously expected to be invisible. Japanese household slaves often served as proxy bodies for their owners, kneeling in uncomfortable positions during long ceremonies, so their masters could observe proper form without discomfort. For female slaves in both societies, sexual vulnerability was a constant reality. The records are mostly silent on this aspect. The literate elite who created the historical documents had little interest in documenting this particular abuse of power, but occasional legal cases and literary references make clear that female slaves were routinely exploited sexually, with any resulting children simply adding to the owner's property inventory. Meals for slaves were meager and monotonous. In Korea, you might receive a daily ration of coarse millet or barley, sometimes supplemented with soup made from wild greens. You gathered yourself during rare moments of reduced supervision. Rice, the prestige grain your labor produced, would rarely pass your lips. Japanese agricultural slaves similarly subsisted on inferior grains, though they might receive occasional protein in the form of small fish or fermented soybeans. The archaeological record offers some insight into slave nutrition through analysis of skeletal remains. Individuals identified as probable slaves show higher rates of nutritional deficiency markers in their bones, lines of arrested growth in teeth, for instance, indicating periods of severe malnutrition during childhood development. Clothing marked your status visibly. Korean slaves were prohibited from wearing certain colors and materials, white hemp clothing becoming the standard slave attire. In Japan, slaves typically wore undyed hemp cloth of the roughest quality. These garments weren't just markers of status, they were physically uncomfortable, adding another layer of daily suffering. The weather offered no respite. In Korea's bitter winters, slaves might receive minimal additional clothing, but frostbite was common. Japan's humid summers brought different torments. The same coarse hemp clothing that left you cold in winter would chafe and irritate skin, made vulnerable by sweat and sun. Shelter from extreme weather was a privilege reserved for the free. For slaves with specialized skills, daily routines could be somewhat less physically grueling, but no less controlled. Some Japanese slaves became artisans, potters, weavers, or metalworkers, whose talents were valuable, but did not earn them freedom. Korean records mention slave entertainers, musicians, and dancers, whose performances delighted the elite, but who remained fundamentally property. Religious observance took different forms for the enslaved. In Korea, slaves were generally excluded from official ceremonies, but developed their own syncretic practices, blending Buddhism, shamanism, and folk beliefs. These often took place at night or in hidden locations. Japanese slaves similarly carved out spiritual spaces where they could, though Buddhist temples themselves, major slaveholders, offered complex and contradictory relationships with the unfree who maintained their sacred spaces. Communication networks among slaves developed despite attempts to prevent them. Agricultural slaves working in proximity could share information during rare moments without supervision. Domestic slaves moving between households on errands became important conduits of information, carrying news of conditions elsewhere, treatment of other slaves, and occasionally plots for resistance. Survival strategies evolved in response to the harsh conditions. Many slaves cultivated a careful performance of docility and simplicity, appearing less capable than they actually were to reduce work expectations. Others specialized in making themselves indispensable through unique skills. Some cultivated relationships with lower-ranking free people who might intervene with owners on their behalf in extreme situations. Health care for slaves was minimal and functional, aimed at maintaining them as working assets rather than ensuring their well-being. Korean medical texts occasionally mention treatments for slaves, but these were typically less elaborate than those prescribed for free people. A slave with a broken limb might receive basic setting and binding, while a similar injury to a free person would merit more extensive treatment, including herbal medicines and follow-up care. When slaves became too old or infirm to work productively, their fates diverged somewhat between the two societies. In Korea, elderly slaves might be manumitted as an act of ceremonial generosity by owners seeking spiritual merit, though without resources or family support. Such freedom often meant destitution and death. Japanese practice sometimes allowed aged slaves to enter a semi-retired status where they performed lighter duties, remaining within the household structure that at least provided basic sustenance. Children born into slavery faced particularly harsh realities. From the earliest age, they could be useful. Perhaps 3 or 4 years old, they would be assigned tasks: gathering firewood, scaring birds from fields, carrying water. Their play was their work. Their education consisted solely of learning the skills that would make them valuable property. Korean documents occasionally mention slave children given as gifts alongside adult slaves, their futures determined before they could speak. The daily interaction between slaves and owners followed elaborate, unwritten rules. In Korea, slaves were required to use specific honorific language when addressing free people, while receiving the lowest forms of address in return. Physical postures of submission, kneeling, bowing, avoiding eye contact, became ingrained bodily habits. Japanese practice similarly encoded status in language and physical bearing, with severe punishments for slaves who failed to properly perform their subordination. Occasionally, the documentary record provides glimpses of how owners viewed their human property. A Korean Yongbin's diary from the 14th century contains the casual note: "Acquired 2 slaves today. The male appears strong enough for field work. The female has bad teeth, but seems adequately skilled in kitchen tasks." The entry continues with equal attention to the purchase of several chickens. This casual equivalence between humans and livestock reveals volumes about how slavery shaped consciousness. Death came earlier for slaves than for the free population. Skeletal analysis shows higher rates of trauma, infection, and malnutrition. Funeral practices reflected status distinctions that persisted beyond death. Slave burials were simpler, with few or no grave goods. In Korea, slaves might be buried in unmarked graves on the edges of their owners' family cemeteries. Japanese practice sometimes included separate burial grounds entirely for the unfree. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work imposed their own patterns on slave life. Spring brought the exhausting labor of planting, summer the constant battle against weeds, autumn the frenzied activity of harvest, and winter a shift to indoor tasks like weaving or repairing tools. Your body would become attuned to these cycles, your muscles developing specific strengths and pains associated with each season's demands. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of daily life for slaves in both societies was the constant psychological burden of knowing your children would inherit your status. As you worked through each grueling day, you were simultaneously ensuring that your descendants would face the same conditions for generations to come. This knowledge must have colored every aspect of existence, from decisions about forming families to the small acts of resistance and accommodation that made survival possible. War has forever been mankind's most efficient creator of human misery, and nowhere was this more evident than in the ancient conflicts between Korea and Japan. The sea that separates these lands today, called the Sea of Japan by some and the East Sea by others, became a well-traveled highway of human suffering. Each military campaign, each raid, each border skirmish produced a fresh crop of the unfree. Let's begin with one of the most consequential conflicts in this bloody history, the Japanese invasions of Korea under Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 1590s. Over 6 years of warfare, an estimated 100,000 Koreans were captured and transported to Japan as slaves. You need to grasp the scale of this human trafficking operation. Imagine entire coastal villages emptied of their inhabitants. Long lines of bound captives marched to waiting ships, families permanently torn apart as they were distributed to new owners across the Japanese archipelago. The Korean potters taken during this conflict deserve special mention. Japanese warlords had developed a taste for Korean ceramics, particularly the refined celadon glazes that Korean artisans had perfected. Rather than simply stealing the pottery, the Japanese took the potters themselves. Entire communities of skilled artisans were forcibly relocated to Japan, where they established new pottery centers like Satsuma and Arita. The exquisite Japanese porcelain that later became famous throughout the world has its origins in this act of cultural kidnapping. But this massive enslavement was hardly the first such event. The relationship between warfare and slavery reaches back to the earliest recorded conflicts between Korean and Japanese polities. 3rd century Chinese accounts describe Japanese, referred to as Wa, raids on Korean coastal settlements, with captives as a primary objective. These weren't battles for territory, but human harvesting operations, quick strikes designed to capture rather than kill. Korean kingdoms weren't merely passive victims in this exchange. When Silla allied with Tang China to defeat Beech in 660 CE, thousands of Beech people were enslaved, some transported to China and others distributed among Silla elites. Political unification often left a trail of enslaved losers in its wake. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century dramatically reshaped the slave systems of both societies. As Mongol forces conquered Goryeo Korea, they took thousands of captives, some sent all the way back to Mongolia, while others were sold into local slavery. When the Mongols later launched their unsuccessful invasions of Japan from Korean territory, Korean shipbuilders and sailors were often pressed into service, a form of temporary unfreedom that frequently became permanent for those captured by the Japanese. What made war such an effective slave creation mechanism was its ability to sever people from their social networks. A person captured far from home, speaking a different language, with no local connections, faced nearly insurmountable barriers to escaping their new unfree status. Military campaigns effectively transformed free individuals into socially isolated units that could be more easily controlled and exploited. The technologies of warfare and slave-taking evolved together. Ships designed for transporting troops could easily be repurposed for carrying human cargo. The The same ropes used to secure military equipment bound human captives. The logistics of feeding armies translated efficiently to the challenge of keeping valuable captives alive until they could be sold or distributed. Here's a quirky detail that reveals something profound about the connection between warfare and enslavement. Japanese pirates, wak, operating in the 14th through 16th centuries, developed specialized net-throwing weapons designed specifically to capture humans without injury. The goal wasn't to kill potential slaves, but to take them intact. Damage reduced their value. These same pirates would sometimes spare skilled captives who could demonstrate immediate value, such as navigators who could guide their ships to new raiding targets, or created slaves not only through direct capture, but through economic devastation. In the aftermath of conflicts, impoverished families in both Korea and Japan sometimes sold children into slavery to survive. Korean records from after the Hideyoshi invasions document numerous cases of families who, facing starvation, sold daughters to Japanese merchants. War's impact on slavery thus extended far beyond the battlefield. Military slaves occupied a particularly complex position in both societies. Captured warriors might be put to death if they were considered too dangerous to control, but those with valuable military knowledge could be incorporated into their captors' forces, occupying an ambiguous status between slave and recruit. Korean sources mention Japanese captives serving in specialized military units, while Japanese records note Korean warriors incorporated into regional forces, particularly in Western Japan. The gender dynamics of war-created slavery followed predictable and disturbing patterns. Young men were valued for labor and potential military service. Young women faced sexual exploitation alongside labor expectations. Older captives of both genders might be killed if they couldn't keep pace during forced marches to ports or markets. Children, while initially traumatized by separation from parents, were considered valuable for their adaptability and potential for complete assimilation. Religious institutions participated actively in the processing of war captives. Buddhist temples in Japan sometimes purchased Korean slaves captured during conflicts, putting them to work on temple lands. Korean Buddhist institutions similarly acquired Japanese captives. The spiritual justification was that captives working in religious settings might absorb Buddhist teachings, improving their karma despite their unfree status. The economic reality was that temples, like other major institutions, simply needed labor. Naval warfare created particularly efficient opportunities for slave taking. Ships captured at sea yielded entire crews as potential slaves. Korean naval records from the 15th century detail procedures for distributing captured Japanese sailors among participating captains, with higher-ranking captives reserved for government officials. Ship-to-ship combat thus had economic incentives beyond mere military victory. The treatment of war captives varied considerably depending on when and where they were taken. Elite captives might be ransomed rather than enslaved, though the line between hostage holding and slavery could blur when ransoms went unpaid. Some skilled captives were treated relatively well if their expertise was valued, Korean metalworkers taken to Japan, for instance, might receive better conditions than unskilled laborers because of their valuable knowledge. Cultural traces of these forced migrations survive in surprising places. Certain Japanese surnames, particularly in Western regions, have Korean origins, reflecting ancestors who were brought as captives and eventually integrated into Japanese society. Similarly, some Korean lineages trace their origins to Japanese captives who, over generations, were absorbed into Korean communities while maintaining distinctive craft traditions or religious practices. Diplomatic efforts occasionally addressed the issue of war captives. Peace negotiations between Korean and Japanese authorities sometimes included provisions for the return of enslaved people, though these were implemented inconsistently at best. A 15th century agreement between the Joseon dynasty and Japan's Ashikaga shogunate included the return of several hundred Korean captives, but this represented a tiny fraction of the total enslaved population. The geography of the Korean peninsula and Japanese archipelago shaped patterns of slave-taking raids. The complex coastlines of both regions, with numerous small islands and hidden bays, created perfect launching points for quick strikes. Small boats could emerge from concealed inlets, attack coastal villages, and disappear with human cargo before defensive forces could respond. Korean defensive networks eventually included coastal watchtowers, specifically designed to warn of slave-taking raids, or not only created new slaves, but could also offer rare opportunities for escape. The chaos of conflict sometimes allowed enslaved people to flee their masters, particularly when invading forces disrupted normal systems of surveillance and control. Korean records mention slaves who escaped during the Hideyoshi invasions, some forming independent communities in mountain regions beyond the reach of both Korean authorities and Japanese invaders. The aftermath of major conflicts created slave markets that could operate for years. After the Hideyoshi invasions, trading posts in Tsushima and other Western Japanese islands specialized in Korean slaves, with merchants developing expertise in transporting, evaluating, and selling human cargo. These markets became so institutionalized that they continued operating during nominal peacetime, creating demand that was met through smaller-scale raids or purchases from Korean intermediaries willing to sell their own countrymen. The military slaves who operated Japanese pirate vessels occupied a particularly ambiguous status. Some began as captives, but gradually assumed roles as active participants in raiding operations, eventually commanding their own crews that captured still more slaves. The line between slave and slaver could blur, creating complex hierarchies of unfreedom where today's victim might become tomorrow's captor. As firearms became more common in East Asian warfare from the 16th century onward, the nature of slave-taking changed. Arquebus and musket fire made traditional capture methods more dangerous, but the devastating effectiveness of these weapons created more total prisoners as entire communities surrendered rather than face annihilation. Military technology thus simultaneously complicated and expanded the connection between warfare and slavery. The long shadow of war-driven enslavement extended for generations. Descendants of Korean potters brought to Japan in the 1590s maintained distinct communities well into the modern era. Some Japanese families today can trace their crafting traditions directly to these enslaved ancestors, creating uncomfortable questions about cultural heritage built on human trafficking. War's bitter harvest of unfreedom represents perhaps the most dramatic but least voluntary path into slavery in ancient Japan and Korea. Unlike debt slavery or criminal punishment, which at least maintained a fiction of justice or personal responsibility, military enslavement made no pretense about its fundamental nature. It was the raw exercise of power, the transformation of military victory into human property. While war provided the most dramatic pathway into bondage, the daily realities of economic life in ancient Korea and Japan created numerous other routes to unfreedom. Debt slavery, in particular, became a sophisticated mechanism for transforming temporary financial hardship into permanent human bondage. Picture a Korean farmer facing a bad harvest, forced to borrow rice seed from a wealthy landowner. The interest rates are crushing, perhaps 50% or more annually, and within a few seasons, the original debt has ballooned beyond any possibility of repayment. The solution, according to the law, is simple. The debtor's labor now belongs to the creditor until the debt is satisfied. Of course, the creditor also controls the accounting. The mathematics of debt slavery were deliberately constructed to be inescapable. Korean legal codes from the Goryeo period specify that debt slaves must work off their obligations at predetermined rates, but these rates were calculated to ensure that basic subsistence costs nearly equaled the daily value of labor. A debt slave might technically be earning toward freedom, but after paying for food, shelter, and clothing, the actual reduction in debt was minimal. Some scholars argue this was intentional economic design, a way to maintain permanent labor forces while preserving the fiction of eventual manumission. Japanese debt slavery followed similar patterns, but with additional complications. The Heian period saw the development of complex credit relationships where entire families could become collateral for loans. A merchant in financial trouble might pledge not just his own labor, but that of his wife and children as security. When the debt inevitably became unpayable, the entire family unit transferred to the creditor. This system created multi-generational unfreedom, where children inherited not just their parents' debts, but their unfree status as well. One particularly ingenious form of debt bondage emerged around Buddhist temples in both societies. Temples would loan money to desperate families, then accept labor service in lieu of monetary repayment. The twist was that temple records were kept by literate monks, while debtors were typically illiterate. This created perfect conditions for creative accounting. Debts could mysteriously increase, payments could be forgotten, and the value of labor could be calculated in whatever way served the temple's interests. Some temple slave communities may have originated from debt relationships that became permanent through such manipulation. Criminal punishment provided another major pathway to unfreedom, though the definition of crime could be remarkably elastic. In Korea, the legal code known as the Jeongguk Dijin specified numerous offenses that could result in enslavement. Theft, of course, but also adultery, repeated drunkenness, and even persistent disobedience to parents could lead to unfree status. Japanese codes similarly criminalized a wide range of behaviors, with particular attention to offenses against social hierarchy. A commoner who struck a nobleman, for instance, might face enslavement even if the physical injury was minor. What made criminal enslavement particularly insidious was how it was often applied selectively based on social status. A Yongbin aristocrat in Korea who committed theft might face a fine or temporary exile, while a commoner committing the same offense could be enslaved. Japanese legal practice showed similar patterns. Punishment for identical crimes varied dramatically based on the offender's social position. Justice, it seemed, was itself a privilege of rank. Family dissolution created another route to bondage. When parents died, leaving minor children with no relatives willing or able to care for them, these orphans often became slaves of whoever took them in. Korean and Japanese societies both developed formal procedures for this process, with local officials sometimes distributing orphaned children to families as a form of poor relief. The children received basic care in exchange for lifelong labor, a transaction that prioritized social order over individual freedom. The practice of exposing unwanted infants created a steady supply of future slaves. Both Korean and Japanese societies practiced infanticide through exposure, particularly of female children during times of economic hardship. Those infants who survived might be taken in by families who needed additional labor, growing up in slave status despite having been born to free parents. Some Buddhist temples maintained foundling systems that essentially processed abandoned children into temple slaves, framing this as charitable work while creating unfree laborers. Natural disasters provided opportunities for mass enslavement. After earthquakes, floods, or famines, large numbers of people might find themselves desperate enough to accept slavery in exchange for basic survival. Korean records document organized slave recruitment following major natural disasters, with wealthy landowners offering food and shelter in exchange for permanent labor obligations. The apprenticeship system sometimes functioned as a pathway to unfreedom. Young people might be apprenticed to master craftsmen under terms that were supposed to lead to independence, but instead resulted in permanent bondage. The master controlled the terms of training and could extend the apprenticeship indefinitely, gradually transforming what was supposed to be education into enslavement. Perhaps most tellingly, both Korean and Japanese legal systems developed elaborate procedures for all these various pathways to unfreedom. This wasn't haphazard oppression, but systematic institutional design. The societies created legal mechanisms that could transform almost any form of vulnerability, economic, social, political, or personal, into permanent bondage. The roads to slavery were numerous and well-maintained, while the paths to freedom remained narrow and treacherous. These multiple pathways to bondage reveal something crucial about how slavery functioned in both societies. It wasn't just a way of dealing with war captives or criminals. It was a comprehensive system for managing social and economic risk by transferring that risk onto the most vulnerable people. When things went wrong, whether through personal misfortune, economic hardship, political upheaval, or natural disaster, slavery provided a solution that benefited the powerful while ensuring that the costs fell on those least able to resist. Here's a particularly grim detail from Korean records. Some wealthy families would deliberately expose their own children during famines, then rescue them once conditions improved, using the legal fiction that these were foundlings to justify treating their own offspring as slaves. This practice allowed families to reduce their support obligations during difficult times while maintaining access to their children's labor. Marriage dissolution could also lead to enslavement, particularly for women. Korean law allowed men to divorce wives for numerous reasons, including failure to produce male heirs, disobedience to in-laws, or adultery. Divorced women with no family support sometimes faced the choice between destitution and voluntary enslavement. Some chose bondage as the more reliable path to survival, particularly if they had children to support. Political persecution created its own pathways to unfreedom. When aristocratic families fell from favor, their retainers and servants might be enslaved as punishment. The Goryeo dynasty's periodic purges of court officials often resulted in the enslavement of entire household staffs. Japanese political upheavals similarly created waves of new slaves as powerful families lost their positions and protection. Religious heterodoxy could also lead to bondage. While Buddhism was generally accepted in both societies, other religious practices were often viewed with suspicion. Korean shamanistic practitioners sometimes faced enslavement as punishment for corrupting public morals. Japanese authorities similarly persecuted various folk religious movements, with participants potentially facing unfree status as punishment for their beliefs. The treatment of foreign residents created another pathway to slavery. Chinese merchants or diplomats who died in Korea or Japan might have their servants and retainers absorbed into local slave populations. The legal fiction was that these individuals had no local protections and thus could be treated as property. Similar logic applied to shipwreck survivors. Foreign sailors who washed ashore might find themselves enslaved rather than repatriated. Economic specialization created opportunities for voluntary enslavement in some circumstances. Skilled artisans facing economic hardship might sell themselves into bondage to wealthy patrons, calculating that the security of guaranteed subsistence outweighed the loss of freedom. Korean ceramic artists and Japanese metalworkers sometimes entered such arrangements, particularly during periods of political instability when independent practice became dangerous. The sale of children by impoverished parents represented one of the most common pathways to unfreedom. Korean and Japanese legal codes both recognized parental authority to sell children, though they imposed some restrictions on the practice. Parents facing starvation might sell daughters into domestic slavery or sons into agricultural bondage. The transaction was often framed as adoption, but the child's status was clearly unfree. Gambling provided another route to bondage. Both Korean and Japanese societies had well-developed gambling cultures, and chronic gamblers might pledge their own labor or that of family members as collateral for bets. When luck inevitably turned bad, the gambler's family could find themselves in unfree status. Some gambling establishments specialized in arrangements that made default highly likely, functioning as recruitment centers for new slaves. Military service offered its own pathways to unfreedom. Soldiers who deserted or showed cowardice in battle might face enslavement as punishment. Korean military codes specified that deserters could be enslaved along with their families, creating powerful incentives for loyalty while providing a ready supply of unfree laborers. Japanese samurai codes included similar provisions, though they were more likely to specify death rather than enslavement for serious military offenses. The taxation system created opportunities for enslavement through default. Both Korean and Japanese governments imposed various forms of taxation, and failure to pay could result in unfree status. Tax collectors were often authorized to seize not just property, but people as payment for delinquent obligations. This created a direct link between state fiscal policy and slavery. Higher taxes meant more defaults, and thus more slaves. To be enslaved in ancient Korea or Japan meant existing in a peculiar liminal space, simultaneously essential to society's functioning, yet officially excluded from its moral community. You were inside the household, tending its fires and raising its children, yet outside the circle of beings whose suffering truly mattered. This strange duality created one of the most psychologically complex forms of human bondage in world history. Buddhist philosophy, which permeated both societies, offered particularly twisted justifications for this exclusion. The doctrine of karma suggested that your enslavement was the result of evil deeds in previous lives. You were literally working off bad karma through your suffering. Some Buddhist texts went further, arguing that serving masters faithfully might improve your karmic situation for future rebirths. Your current agony became spiritually productive, a form of cosmic debt payment that made your bondage almost virtuous. Yet this same Buddhist framework also insisted on the fundamental equality of all sentient beings. Every human possessed Buddha nature, the potential for enlightenment. This created a theological contradiction that Buddhist institutions resolved through remarkable intellectual contortions. Temple slaves might participate in certain Buddhist rituals while being excluded from others. They could accumulate merit through their labor, but couldn't fully access the religious community that labor supported. Korean Confucian ideology added another layer of justification. The concept of social harmony depended on everyone accepting their proper place in the cosmic order. Slaves who remained content in their bondage were fulfilling their role in maintaining universal balance. Rebellion, or even discontent, represented not just disobedience to masters, but disruption of the fundamental ordering principles of reality itself. This ideological framework created what scholars now recognize as social death. Slaves existed biologically, but not socially. Korean legal codes reflected this conceptual exclusion by referring to slaves using different grammatical forms than those applied to free people. Japanese legal language similarly distinguished between people, human beings with social existence, things that could speak, slaves with biological, but not social reality. Yet slaves weren't completely outside society. They were intimately involved in its most sacred and private spaces. Korean slaves prepared food for ancestor worship ceremonies, handling the offerings that connected the living with the dead. Japanese slaves maintained Shinto shrines, cleaning the sacred spaces where kami resided. This proximity to the sacred, while being excluded from its benefits, created profound psychological tensions. The religious lives of slaves developed in response to these contradictions. In Korea, slave communities created syncretic practices, blending Buddhism, shamanism, and folk beliefs. These often focused on spirits of the oppressed, deities who understood suffering and might offer protection to the powerless. Japanese slave communities similarly developed underground religious practices, sometimes centered around Buddhist figures like Jizo, who was believed to have special compassion for those suffering in hell realms. Some of these slave religious practices included subtle forms of resistance. Korean shamanic rituals performed by slaves sometimes invoked curses against cruel masters, though always in coded language that provided plausible deniability. Japanese slave communities developed their own interpretations of Buddhist teachings that emphasized the temporary nature of all social conditions. What is low now might be high in the next life. The cultural production of slaves created another form of ambiguous existence. Korean slave musicians and dancers were essential to elite entertainment, yet they remained socially invisible. Their artistic skills were valued, while their humanity was denied. Japanese court records mention slave entertainers whose performances delighted audiences who would never acknowledge them as fellow human beings. Language itself reflected and reinforced these social boundaries. Korean slaves were required to use the most deferential forms of honorific speech when addressing any free person, while receiving the lowest forms of address in return. The very words available for discussing slaves emphasized their status as objects rather than subjects. Japanese linguistic practices followed similar patterns, with elaborate vocabulary systems that encoded social hierarchy into every conversation. The sexual exploitation of slaves occupied a particularly complex cultural space. Male slaveholders routinely used female slaves sexually, yet the children of these relationships existed in ambiguous categories. Korean law typically assigned children the status of their mothers, making them slaves regardless of their father's rank. But cultural attitudes were more complex. Some elite Korean men developed genuine affection for slave concubines, occasionally manumitting them or their children. Japanese practices around slave sexuality showed similar complexity. The concept of multiple wives and concubines was culturally accepted among the elite, and slave women often occupied concubine positions. Yet, they remained property, even while bearing their master's children. Some achieved significant influence within households, despite their legal status, wielding power over other slaves and sometimes free servants. The material culture of slavery reflects these contradictory positions. Archaeological evidence shows that some slave quarters contained objects of surprising quality, ceramic vessels that were functional but also aesthetically pleasing, personal ornaments that served no practical purpose. These artifacts suggest that even within bondage, people created spaces for beauty and self-expression. Slave clothing provides another window into this cultural complexity. While legal codes mandated that slaves wear inferior materials and specific colors, the actual garments sometimes showed elaborate needlework and decorative elements. Korean archaeological sites have yielded slave garments with intricate embroidery, suggesting that people found ways to express artistic impulses even within the constraints of their unfree status. Here's a revealing detail from Japanese court records. Slave artisans sometimes signed their work with personal marks or signatures, despite having no legal identity. Pottery fragments from slave workshops bear these individual marks, suggesting that creative identity persisted even when legal personhood was denied. The contrast between social invisibility and artistic signature reveals the psychological complexity of slave existence. The funeral practices surrounding slaves further illuminate their ambiguous cultural position. Korean elite families sometimes included favorite slaves in family burial grounds, though in clearly subordinate positions and with simpler grave goods. These burials suggest relationships that transcended pure property ownership while never fully acknowledging full humanity. Japanese Buddhist temples that owned large numbers of slaves sometimes provided rudimentary funeral services for deceased slaves, but these were typically group ceremonies without individual recognition. The temples fulfilled their Buddhist obligation to provide proper death rites while maintaining the social fiction that slaves weren't fully human. Seasonal festivals created particularly complex situations for slave participation. Korean harvest celebrations often included slave performers and workers, yet they participated as entertainment rather than community members. Japanese religious festivals similarly incorporated slave labor and sometimes slave participation, but within carefully maintained hierarchical boundaries. The education of slave children reveals another dimension of cultural ambiguity. Korean elite households sometimes provided basic literacy training to clever slave children who might become more useful as scribes or accountants. Yet, this education was purely functional. It wasn't meant to develop the child as a person, but to increase their value as property. Some Korean slaves achieved remarkable learning despite their status. Temple records mention slave monks who became accomplished scholars, mastering complex Buddhist texts and philosophical arguments. Yet, their intellectual achievements remained formally anonymous. Their insights might influence temple teachings, but they couldn't be acknowledged as the source. The question of slave names deserves attention here. Many slaves were given names by their owners, often descriptive terms rather than personal names. Korean slaves might be called strong ox or quiet girl rather than receiving proper personal names. Yet, evidence suggests that slave communities maintained their own naming systems, with birth names preserved within slave families even when masters used different appellations. Marriage among slaves occupied another ambiguous cultural space. Korean law generally didn't recognize slave marriages as legally binding, yet slave communities clearly maintained marriage customs and family structures. These relationships existed socially while being legally invisible, creating parallel kinship systems within slave communities. The religious conception of slave marriages was similarly complex. Buddhist ideology suggested that all beings could form karmic connections through loving relationships, yet institutional Buddhism rarely acknowledged slave marriages in any formal sense. Some temple records mention slave pairs or partnerships without using marriage terminology, suggesting recognition without full acknowledgement. Perhaps most revealing is how both Korean and Japanese cultures developed elaborate etiquette systems governing interactions between free people and slaves. These weren't simply about maintaining dominance. They were complex cultural scripts that allowed daily interaction while maintaining social fiction. Free people learned specific ways of speaking to slaves that acknowledged their utility while denying their humanity. The cultural position of slaves in both societies thus represents one of history's more sophisticated systems of inclusion through exclusion. Slaves were simultaneously essential and invisible, valuable and worthless, intimate and alien. They existed at the very center of society's most important functions while being denied membership in society itself. This cultural contradiction would prove to be one of slavery's most enduring psychological torments, being needed by the very people who refused to acknowledge your existence as a fellow human being. Resistance among the enslaved in ancient Korea and Japan took forms that ranged from subtle daily subversion to spectacular acts of rebellion. The historical record, written almost exclusively by the free and powerful, systematically downplays this resistance. But if you know how to read between the lines, evidence of slave defiance emerges from the most unlikely sources. Let's begin with the most common form of resistance, the deliberate incompetence that slaves performed with academy, award-worthy skill. Korean household slaves developed an art form of appearing too stupid to understand complex instructions, too clumsy to handle delicate tasks, too weak to complete heavy labor efficiently. This wasn't actual incompetence. It was a carefully calibrated performance designed to reduce work expectations without triggering punishment. Japanese agricultural slaves mastered similar techniques. Records from estate managers consistently complain about slaves who somehow couldn't grasp the timing of rice planting, despite having performed the same tasks for years. Tools would break at convenient moments. Animals would mysteriously escape from poorly secured enclosures, and counting errors would consistently favor the slave's interests. This passive resistance was nearly impossible to prove, yet enormously effective at undermining the efficiency of slave labor. Sabotage took more creative forms as well. Korean slaves working in aristocratic kitchens occasionally employed what we might call gastronomic warfare, adding unpleasant flavors to food or timing meal preparation to cause social embarrassment for their masters. Nothing dramatic enough to warrant severe punishment, but enough to create constant low-level irritation. Japanese textile slaves were known to weave subtle flaws into expensive fabrics, defects that would only become apparent after the cloth was cut and sewn. The theft networks that developed among slave communities reveal sophisticated forms of economic resistance. Slaves couldn't legally own property, but they developed elaborate systems for redistributing resources. Korean temple slaves, for instance, would redistribute rice from temple granaries to slave quarters, maintaining detailed mental accounting systems to ensure fair distribution. Japanese household slaves created networks for sharing clothing, tools, and food across multiple households. One particularly ingenious form of Korean slave resistance involved manipulating the Buddhist merit system. Slaves would perform acts of religious devotion, leaving flowers at shrines, lighting incense, chanting prayers, while secretly directing their merit toward the punishment of cruel masters. Buddhist theology held that merit could be transferred, so slaves could simultaneously appear pious while engaging in what they considered spiritual warfare. Escape attempts, while dangerous, occurred with surprising frequency. The geography of both regions offered advantages and disadvantages for runaway slaves. Korea's mountainous terrain provided hiding places, but also made travel difficult. Japan's island nature created natural barriers to escape, but offered numerous small islands where fugitive communities might establish themselves beyond the reach of authorities. Some escape attempts were carefully planned group endeavors. Korean records from the Goryeo period mention entire slave communities disappearing overnight, suggesting coordinated resistance movements. Japanese documents describe similar mass escapes, particularly from large agricultural estates where slaves could organize without constant supervision. The punishment for captured runaways was severe, typically involving facial branding, additional years of service, and sometimes death. Yet the attempts continued, suggesting that the psychological benefits of resistance outweighed the risks of punishment. Even failed escape attempts served a purpose, demonstrating to other slaves that resistance was possible and maintaining hope that freedom might be achievable. Religious resistance took sophisticated forms in both cultures. Korean slave communities developed their own interpretations of Buddhist teachings that emphasized the temporary nature of all social conditions. If karma explained their current suffering, it also promised that their oppressors would face consequences in future lives. Some slave religious practices included elaborate curses disguised as prayers, calling upon Buddhist and shamanic deities to punish cruel masters. Japanese slaves similarly adapted religious frameworks for resistance purposes. Some slave communities embraced Pure Land Buddhism, which promised salvation regardless of social status. The teaching that all beings could achieve enlightenment through faith rather than good works offered powerful psychological resources for resistance. If Buddha nature was universal, then current social hierarchies were illusions that would eventually be revealed as meaningless. Here's a fascinating detail from a Japanese temple record. Slave monks sometimes inserted subtle alterations into religious texts. They were copying, changing passages about social hierarchy or the treatment of the poor. These changes wouldn't be noticed by illiterate temple officials, but would be recognized by other literate slaves who read the texts. This represents a form of intellectual resistance, using literacy as a weapon against the system that had granted it for purely practical purposes. Communication networks among slaves developed despite efforts to prevent them. Korean agricultural slaves working in proximity could share information during brief moments without supervision. Japanese domestic slaves moving between households on errands became vital links in information networks, carrying news about conditions elsewhere, escape routes, and resistance strategies. Slave artisans found their own methods of resistance through their craft. Korean ceramic slaves would sometimes incorporate hidden symbols or messages into their work, coded communications that could be recognized by other slaves but appeared decorative to free observers. Japanese metalworking slaves occasionally created tools that appeared normal but had subtle modifications that made them less effective, a form of industrial sabotage disguised as craftsmanship. The most spectacular form of resistance was open rebellion, though these events were rare enough that each one entered historical memory. The Korean slave uprising of 1173 during the military rule period saw slaves temporarily take control of several districts, establishing their own governance structures before being brutally suppressed. The rebellion's leader, a slave named Manjiok, became a folk hero in slave communities despite, or perhaps because of his eventual execution. Japanese slave rebellions were generally smaller in scale, but equally desperate. The Heian period saw several incidents where household slaves turned on their masters, though these were typically portrayed in official records as isolated cases of madness rather than organized resistance. The real scale of slave unrest was likely much larger than official documents suggest, since authorities had strong incentives to minimize reports of slave defiance. Some resistance took the form of what modern scholars call cultural retention, slaves maintaining elements of their original cultures despite attempts at forced assimilation. Korean slaves of Japanese origin might preserve Japanese customs within their communities, while Japanese slaves of Korean heritage maintained Korean practices. This cultural resistance served both practical and psychological purposes, maintaining connections to identities that transcended their slave status. Family protection became another form of resistance. Slave parents would go to extraordinary lengths to shield their children from the worst aspects of bondage, sometimes accepting additional punishment themselves to spare their offspring. Korean slave mothers developed elaborate strategies for hiding their children's abilities to prevent them from being sold to more demanding masters. The phenomenon of slave suicide deserves attention as the ultimate form of resistance. Both Korean and Japanese records contain references to slaves who chose death rather than continued bondage. While authorities typically portrayed these deaths as evidence of mental instability, slave communities often viewed suicide as a form of resistance, a final assertion of individual agency in situations where all other choices had been eliminated. Some slaves found ways to turn their master's superstitions against them. Korean household slaves who understood their owners' fears of ghosts and evil spirits could subtly manipulate these anxieties to improve their conditions. Moving objects at night, creating unexplained sounds, or appearing in places where they shouldn't be could convince superstitious masters that supernatural forces were protecting particularly mistreated slaves. The resistance of slave women took forms shaped by their additional vulnerabilities: sexual resistance, avoiding or undermining the sexual exploitation that was an expected part of female bondage, required particular creativity. Some Korean female slaves used herbal knowledge to prevent pregnancy, understanding that bearing children would increase their value to masters, while deepening their own bondage through maternal attachment. Legal resistance occasionally emerged when slaves gained access to formal complaint mechanisms. Some Korean temples maintained procedures for slaves to petition against particularly cruel treatment, though these were rarely effective. Japanese legal codes included theoretical protections for slaves against extreme abuse, but slaves who attempted to use these protections faced enormous risks. Perhaps the most psychologically important form of resistance was the maintenance of hope itself. Slave communities developed rich oral traditions that preserved stories of successful escapes, rebellious heroes, and promises of eventual liberation. These narratives served crucial psychological functions, providing models for resistance and maintaining belief that current conditions weren't permanent. The ultimate form of resistance was generational: slave parents teaching their children survival skills, resistance techniques, and most importantly, the knowledge that their current condition didn't define their worth as human beings. This intergenerational transmission of resistance culture ensured that each new generation of slaves inherited not just bondage, but also the tools and knowledge necessary to fight against it. Remember that damp wool tunic from our earlier discussion. Even something as simple as clothing became a site of resistance. Slaves found ways to modify their required garments, adding hidden pockets for contraband, reinforcing fabric in ways that made it last longer than masters expected, or incorporating small decorative elements that asserted individual identity despite attempts at dehumanization. The resistance of enslaved people in ancient Korea and Japan reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. The desire for freedom and dignity cannot be completely suppressed, no matter how thorough the system of oppression. Every act of defiance, from the smallest gesture of incompetence to the most dramatic rebellion, represented an assertion of humanity in the face of institutions designed to deny that humanity existed. Now let's examine how slavery in ancient Korea and Japan compared to each other, revealing both unique features and shared experiences that illuminate the broader nature of East Asian bondage. While both systems drew from Chinese legal traditions and Buddhist philosophical frameworks, they developed distinct characteristics that reflected their different political structures, economic needs, and cultural values. Korean slavery was generally more rigid and hereditary than its Japanese counterpart. The bone rank system in Silla and later developments in Goryeo and Joseon created clearly defined caste boundaries that were nearly impossible to cross. If you were born Nobai in Korea, your children grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would almost certainly inherit the same status. Korean legal codes explicitly stated that slave status passed through the maternal line, creating a self-perpetuating system where each generation of slave women produced the next generation of unfree laborers. Japanese slavery, while certainly oppressive, maintained somewhat more fluid boundaries. The various categories of unfree status, nuhai, kenin, and others, sometimes allowed for movement between different levels of bondage, or even occasional manumission. Japanese legal traditions included more mechanisms for slaves to potentially improve their status through exceptional service, adoption by masters, or religious conversion in certain circumstances. The scale of slavery differed dramatically between the two societies. Scholars estimate that by the late Goryeo period, slaves may have constituted nearly half of Korea's total population, an extraordinarily high percentage that made Korea one of history's most thoroughly enslaved societies. Japanese slavery, while significant, never reached these proportions. Even at its peak, slaves probably comprised no more than 10–15% of Japan's population, though regional variations could be substantial. This difference in scale reflects underlying economic structures. Korean agriculture, with its emphasis on large estates worked by gangs of unfree laborers, created demand for massive slave populations. Japanese agriculture, while also using slave labor, relied more heavily on various forms of dependent peasantry that weren't technically slavery, but weren't exactly freedom either. The Korean Yongbin aristocracy built their wealth on the backs of huge slave populations, while Japanese elites used more diverse labor arrangements. The treatment of slave families reveals another crucial difference. Korean slavery was more likely to keep family units together, partly because the hereditary nature of the system made family stability economically beneficial to masters. If slave children would remain slaves regardless, there was less incentive to break up families than in systems where children might potentially gain freedom. Japanese slavery was more willing to separate family members when economically advantageous. The sale of individual slaves rather than family units was more common in Japan, creating psychological trauma that was somewhat less frequent in Korea. However, Japanese slaves who remained in family units sometimes faced less surveillance than their Korean counterparts, since Japanese masters were less concerned about hereditary slave populations growing too large. Religious institutions played different roles in the two systems. Korean Buddhist temples became massive slaveholders, owning thousands of unfree individuals who worked temple lands and maintained religious buildings. These temple slaves developed their own communities and religious practices, sometimes achieving considerable autonomy within their bondage. Japanese Buddhist institutions also owned slaves, but on a smaller scale and with less development of distinct slave religious cultures. The gender dynamics of slavery showed interesting variations between the two societies. Korean female slaves faced particular vulnerabilities due to their reproductive value. Their ability to produce future generations of slaves made them especially valuable property. Japanese female slaves were more likely to be valued for specialized skills like weaving or artistic performance, though sexual exploitation remained common in both systems. Korean slave women had slightly more legal protection against extreme sexual abuse, though this protection was minimal and rarely enforced. Japanese slave women faced more arbitrary treatment, but also had more opportunities to potentially improve their status through relationships with masters or by developing valuable artistic skills. Here's a quirky difference that reveals deeper cultural patterns. Korean slaves were more likely to receive formal names rather than descriptive appellations. While these names were chosen by masters and often reflected slave status, they at least acknowledged some degree of individual identity. Japanese slaves were more commonly referred to by descriptive terms or numbers, suggesting even less recognition of individual personhood. The economic integration of slavery also differed significantly. Korean slaves were essential to agricultural production, craft manufacturing, and domestic service. The economy simply couldn't function without massive, unfree labor. Japanese slavery was more supplementary, providing additional labor for specific tasks, while the economy could theoretically function without it. This economic difference affected the cultural status of slavery in each society. Korean slavery was so central to economic life that it was largely taken for granted. Opposition to the institution itself was rare because it was so foundational. Japanese slavery, being less economically central, faced more philosophical and religious criticism, though this rarely translated into actual abolition efforts. The geographic differences between a peninsula and an archipelago shaped escape patterns in interesting ways. Korean slaves could potentially flee to China or to remote mountain regions within Korea itself. Japanese slaves faced water barriers that made escape more difficult, but also created opportunities to establish fugitive communities on uninhabited islands. Military service created different opportunities and vulnerabilities for slaves in each society. Korean slaves were occasionally recruited for military service during emergencies, though this rarely led to freedom. Japanese slaves were less commonly used as soldiers, but more often employed in military support roles like construction or logistics. The documentation of slavery differs between the two societies in ways that affect our historical understanding. Korean records, influenced by Chinese bureaucratic traditions, maintained more systematic documentation of slave populations, sales, and legal proceedings. Japanese records are more fragmentary and literary, providing vivid individual details but less comprehensive statistical information. Legal protections for slaves, minimal though they were, showed different emphases. Korean law was more concerned with protecting masters' property rights in their slaves, while Japanese law paid more attention to preventing slaves from disrupting social harmony. Both approaches prioritize the interests of the free population, but they reveal different conceptions of what slavery was supposed to accomplish. The regional variations within each country also merit attention. Northern Korea, with its harsher climate and proximity to nomadic peoples, developed more militarized forms of slavery. Southern Korea, with its agricultural focus, created the large plantation-style slave communities. In Japan, Western regions with closer ties to Korea had different slavery patterns than Eastern areas, while island communities developed their own unique practices. Urban slavery functioned differently in the two societies. Korean cities like Kaesong and later Seoul had substantial slave populations working in craft production and domestic service. Japanese urban centers used slaves more selectively, often for specialized tasks rather than general labor. This difference reflects the overall scale difference between the two systems. The treatment of aged or infirm slaves reveals cultural differences in conceptions of obligation and value. Korean masters were more likely to maintain elderly slaves within household structures, partly because the hereditary system created longer-term relationships between slave families and master families. Japanese masters were more willing to abandon slaves who were no longer productive, though Buddhist influence sometimes encouraged minimal care for the aged. Perhaps most significantly, the two systems developed different attitudes toward the legitimacy of slavery itself. Korean Confucian ideology provided robust justifications for hereditary bondage as part of the natural social order. Japanese attitudes were more ambivalent, with Buddhist influences creating some tension with slavery practices, even if this tension rarely resulted in institutional changes. The eventual decline of slavery also followed different patterns. Korean slavery persisted longer and was more formally abolished through specific legal reforms in the late 19th century. Japanese slavery gradually transformed into other forms of unfree labor, making the exact end point more difficult to identify. Both systems shared the fundamental characteristic of treating human beings as property, but the specific ways they implemented this treatment reflected broader cultural differences between the two societies. Korean slavery was more systematic, hereditary, and economically central. Japanese slavery was more variable, potentially temporary, and economically supplementary. These differences matter because they illuminate how similar ideological frameworks, Buddhism, Confucianism, Chinese legal traditions, could produce significantly different outcomes depending on local conditions. The comparison also reveals that slavery wasn't a monolithic institution, but a flexible system that adapted to different economic needs, social structures, and cultural values. Understanding these comparative dimensions helps us grasp why slavery proved so durable in both societies while taking different forms in each. The shared elements, the dehumanization, the economic exploitation, the cultural justifications, reveal universal features of unfree labor systems. The differences remind us that even the most oppressive institutions are shaped by the specific societies that create and maintain them. We've traveled far tonight, through centuries of rice paddies and silk workshops, past the whispered prayers of the enslaved and the casual cruelty of their masters. Now, as we reach the final stretch of this dark journey, you might assume these ancient systems of bondage simply evaporated with the coming of modernity, that somehow the Meiji Restoration in Japan and Korea's eventual liberation from Japanese colonial rule swept away all traces of these hierarchical nightmares. You'd be wonderfully, naively wrong. The ghosts of ancient slavery don't simply pack their bags and leave when new constitutions are written. They linger in the shadows of social structures, whispering their influence into the ears of each new generation. In Japan, the descendants of the Hinin and Eida, those untouchable classes who had lived as social slaves for centuries, found themselves rebranded as bureaucramen in the modern era. Same discrimination, shinier terminology. It's like calling a dungeon a subterranean lifestyle apartment. The change in vocabulary doesn't alter the fundamental experience of being trapped underground. Even today, in Japan's gleaming cities, where bullet trains slice through landscapes once worked by bonded laborers, subtle forms of the old hierarchies persist. Marriage databases still quietly track bloodlines. Certain neighborhoods carry invisible stigmas that real estate agents navigate with the delicacy of bomb disposal experts. The ancient system of hereditary bondage may have been officially abolished, but its social DNA continues to replicate in employment practices, housing discrimination, and the 1,000 tiny cuts of casual prejudice. Remember those rice fields where enslaved Koreans once bent their backs under Japanese overseers. The psychological architecture of that relationship didn't disappear when the colonial period ended. It simply evolved, like a virus learning to survive in a new host. Korea's modern relationship with its history of slavery is even more complex, layered as it is with the trauma of Japanese occupation. The Yongbin class system, with its rigid hierarchy of nobles, commoners, and slaves, officially crumbled in the 20th century, but its echoes reverberate through contemporary Korean society like aftershocks from an ancient earthquake. The obsession with educational pedigree, the importance of family lineage, the way certain surnames still carry weight in business circles. These are the modern manifestations of a society that once divided people into hereditary castes as rigid as concrete. What's particularly fascinating in that uncomfortable way that makes you shift in your bed is how both societies have constructed elaborate cultural amnesias around their histories of slavery. Japan's textbooks skim over the topic like a stone skipping across water, touching down briefly before bouncing away to safer historical ground. Korea, caught between the desire to acknowledge its own complex past and the political necessity of focusing on Japanese colonial crimes, often finds itself in the awkward position of a person trying to discuss their complicated family history at a dinner party. The conversation keeps getting redirected to safer topics, but slavery's fingerprints are everywhere if you know where to look. In Japan's modern workplace culture, with its emphasis on absolute hierarchy and unquestioning obedience to superiors, you can glimpse the shadow of the old master-servant relationships. The way junior employees are expected to serve their seniors, pour their drinks, absorb their criticism without complaint. It's the ancient dynamics of bondage, dressed up in business suits and called corporate culture. The psychological infrastructure remains remarkably intact, just with better health insurance and the theoretical option to quit. In Korea, the legacy manifests differently, but no less persistently. The extraordinary emphasis on social status, the way people's worth is still measured by their family background and educational achievements, the rigid respect for hierarchy that can make a conversation feel like a minefield of proper honorifics. These are the modern descendants of a society that once legally divided people into masters and property. The old Yongbin aristocrats may be gone, but their psychological architecture lives on in every anxious parent pushing their child toward the perfect university, every business meeting where everyone knows exactly where they stand in the invisible pecking order. Perhaps most troubling is how both societies have internalized these hierarchies so completely that they're nearly invisible to the people living within them. It's like asking a fish to describe water. The medium is so fundamental to their existence that it becomes impossible to perceive. Young Japanese and Korean people today might roll their eyes at their parents' obsession with status and hierarchy, but they're still swimming in the same cultural waters that were shaped by centuries of legalized bondage. The economic structures tell a similar story. Japan's modern practice of importing foreign workers for jobs that domestic workers won't take, construction, agriculture, domestic service, bears an uncomfortable resemblance to those ancient patterns of using outsiders as a disposable labor force. The faces have changed. The legal framework is different, but the underlying dynamic of exploiting vulnerable populations for menial work remains stubbornly familiar. It's like watching the same play performed by different actors across the centuries. Korea's rapid industrialization, too, carried echoes of the old forced labor systems. The way workers were expected to sacrifice everything for economic development, the acceptance of brutal working conditions as necessary for progress, the way individual suffering was subordinated to collective goals. These weren't just byproducts of modernization, but continuations of ancient attitudes about human expendability that had been refined over centuries of slavery and bondage. Even the way both societies discuss, or rather, avoid discussing, this history reveals the lasting power of these old systems. There's a particular kind of silence that surrounds uncomfortable truths, a cultural muscle memory that instinctively deflects attention from topics too painful or shameful to examine directly. It's the same silence that once protected masters from having to confront the humanity of their property, now repurposed to protect entire societies from grappling with the implications of their past. But perhaps the most profound legacy is how these ancient systems of bondage shaped fundamental attitudes about human worth and social organization. The idea that some people are naturally suited for servitude while others are born to command, that hierarchy is the natural order of things, that individual suffering is acceptable if it serves a greater social good. These weren't just convenient rationalizations for historical exploitation. They became deep cultural assumptions that continue to influence everything from education policy to workplace culture to international relations. You can see it in the way both societies still struggle with concepts of individual rights versus collective harmony, in their approaches to dealing with minorities and outsiders, in their complex relationships with democracy and egalitarianism. The ancient master's voice still whispers in the ear of modern authority figures, and the slave's learned helplessness still echoes in the way people relate to power. Yet there's something almost beautiful in the way these dark histories persist. Not beautiful in their content, certainly, but in their demonstration of how deeply human societies remember, even when they're trying desperately to forget. Every prejudice overcome, every hierarchy challenged, every small act of resistance against inherited inequality becomes a victory, not just over present injustice, but over the accumulated weight of centuries of bondage and exploitation. As you lie here in the darkness, feeling sleep begin to pull at the edges of your consciousness, remember that history isn't just a collection of dead facts from dusty books. It's a living thing, breathing through the structures and assumptions and unconscious biases of the present moment. Those ancient slaves, bent over their rice paddies and silk looms, their struggles and suffering and small acts of resistance, they're still with us. Their legacy woven into the fabric of modern societies in ways both obvious and invisible. The past isn't past, as someone once said. It's not even past. It lives in the spaces between words, in the assumptions we never question, in the hierarchies we accept as natural. Those ancient systems of bondage may have officially ended, but their shadows stretch long across the centuries, touching every aspect of how these societies understand themselves and their place in the world. And perhaps that's the most important thing to understand as you drift towards sleep. That history isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's the invisible foundation beneath your feet, the air you breathe, the lens through which you see the world. Those ancient slaves and masters, their struggles and compromises and cruelties, they live on in 1,000 subtle ways, shaping the present moment, even as we sleep, even as we dream, even as we try to imagine a future finally free from the weight of their bitter legacy. Now, as we reach the end of our journey through these dark corridors of history, let yourself feel the weight of all we've discovered together. The rice fields and silk workshops, the brutal hierarchies and quiet resistances, the way the past breathes through the present like wind through old bones. You've traveled far tonight, through centuries of human suffering and resilience, and you've emerged with a deeper understanding of how the world came to be the way it is. Let these stories settle into your mind like sediment in still water. The Korean kissing with her hidden poetry, the Japanese Hinnon finding dignity in their defiance, the countless unnamed souls who bent but did not break under the weight of bondage. Their voices have been your companions tonight, whispering their truths across the centuries. Feel yourself growing heavier now, your breathing slowing as the weight of history transforms into the gentle weight of sleep. These ancient struggles, these forgotten lives, they've done their work for tonight. They've shown you their secrets, shared their pain and their strength, and now they're ready to let you rest. Close your eyes and let the images fade. The morning mist over Korean rice paddies, the soft click of silk looms in Japanese workshops, the quiet rebellion of those who refused to be reduced to their bondage. Let it all dissolve into the warm darkness behind your eyelids, becoming part of your dreams, part of your deeper understanding of the world. Sleep now, knowing that you've honored these forgotten voices by listening, by witnessing, by carrying their stories forward into tomorrow. The past has spoken to you tonight, And now it's time to let it rest. Let it all rest. Let yourself rest in the gentle embrace of understanding, in the soft comfort of knowing that even the darkest histories can teach us how to be more human, more compassionate, more awake to the struggles of others. Sweet dreams.